Bruma is a large-scale DLC-type mod for Skyrim that reintroduces Bruma as seen in Oblivion, which includes the content inside it, such as the connections to the lore as well as new races and such other things. Most of its content is quests and lore, and it's jam-packed with it. So before I begin this review, I just want to pretext this by mentioning a pet peeve I have sort of accumulated. This has nothing to do with Bruma. In fact, the Beyond Skyrim team has often put these disclaimers in front of their trailers and their teasers and such. But I just want to say, if you're a modder and you post pictures of your mod on Nexus or ModDB or whatever, please do us all a favor and at the very least mention that you're using ENB and visual improvement mods, or at least put a disclaimer that you're using visual improvement mods. And this is mainly for the sake of newbies or people that don't realize these things, that they're going to look at a screenshot of your mod because you're using these improvement mods. Yours is going to look a lot better, and then when they download it and play it, they're going to realize that it's nowhere near how it looked according to your screenshots that you put up there as a marketing strategy. And it's kind of like, well, you're kind of in some way offering this product, although you're doing it for free in this case. And it's reminiscent of the restaurant industry, in which they put menus up with good-looking food, and then once you get the food, it's ugly. But in that case, it's just taste. Visuals are not so much the most important factor, but here visuals are far more important, and it's obviously deceptive that you would do that. Of course, I get it, it's a marketing strategy, but it's really not necessary. Particularly because once they actually download it, they're going to realize that it's not as good as you made it look. And this is even worse for people who, for designers who are creating their mod based on the assumption that other people are going to have ENB and such. Because then you can introduce a custom mesh or something like that, and the NIF file has some particular texture sub-property that makes it look really ugly in vanilla, because something like a very high specular strength in vanilla through the lens of a vanilla visualization is far uglier than a static mesh in that same static mesh, that same NIF file in ENB. So that's just something to note, but let's go ahead with the review. The architecture in Bruma, both using vanilla set pieces and new set pieces, has sufficient structure demonstrated through the evident display of the use of symmetry and rigidity to generate aesthetic layouts, including the standard uses of corridors and pillars for visual pattern formation. This includes the topographical portion of the level space as well, as architecture also comprises the subtraction of space and the visible space around that subtraction, if you were to consider that a visual barrier removes absence from empty space. So you could imagine something like having a pillar in the center of a room, and essentially you could imagine effectively that pillar is removing emptiness from that space. So it's subtracting emptiness. At the same time, the room itself is subtracting emptiness, as it's now occupied by something before there was nothing. And so the space that encompasses the room and around the pillar is part of architecture and should be considered something to scrutinize as well. The best exemplification of adeptness in structural design is found in the dungeons whose composition is mostly artificial architecture sets like Nordic and Imperial set pieces, where the authors appear to form interiors with some central layout within them, which interestingly is something to compare to a mod like Enderal that sort of strays away from that and focuses on asymmetric layouts. Now, realizing that the authors had to craft some regions to certain specifications, since they're trying to recreate something that has already been created, we ought to look at what they did within those constraints to qualify innovation. The saying that restriction is the mother of creativity is technically true, as increasing the number of rules for an artist to follow requires more creative planning for that artist to make something in light of those rules. So there is credit to be given for the relative freshness of Bruma itself, but in addition, we ought to pay attention to what the authors did with the opportunities given to them within the constraints of Bruma. And when focusing on those details, there isn't too much innovation to behold, except in the exteriors and in the vanilla set-piece dungeons. And generally, we can think of something that has increasingly more constraints as a more challenging platform on which an artist creates something. Because no question that an artist that has basically anything to choose from can create anything they wish. They're not bound by certain rules. As you begin to add certain rules onto the space on which they're supposed to create something, it becomes more difficult to create. And the whole element of creativity is to find some way to get around those rules and still create something artistically profound. One other interesting comparison with Enderal is the focal emphasis on regions in a visual space. In Enderal, focal techniques are used to deter the player from noticing architectural simplicity or jadedness, which Bruma does not do, and that acts as a benefit in the cases where innovation is used, but in every other case the typicality of an area is underscored. The atmosphere is visually immersive, but atmospherically mild in most cases. The occasions where atmosphere escapes its lukewarm condition are largely found outside of Bruma, in dungeons and caves where more fundamentally and easily conveyable atmospheres can be experimented with. So you can imagine that something like a dungeon, no question, would easily be a location in which an author, a designer, can craft an atmosphere that is grim, macabre, intimidating, that evokes emotions that are around the emotions of fear, or maybe in some cases some other negative moods of similar tenor. And so if we do a quick comparison to something like Enderal, we can see in Enderal that they were looking for more intense atmospheres, something that has an obvious sense of mood, something that the player can more easily feel. For example, in Undercity, again, high contrast, low saturation, and a very strong and stark tone, both in terms of visual and auditory domains, that is collectively something that the player could easily determine. Whereas you have something in Bruma where within the area of Bruma, most interiors kind of have this very mild personality, visual personality, soft lights, and across those interiors there's a very homogeneous resultant average atmosphere, as it were. And this can also be seen even in the castle, that most of the rooms are illuminated with soft lights. They're very gentle, open spaces that is visually gentle and simplistic, whereas you can evoke different, more intense emotions with something seen in Enderal, as I previously mentioned. The music specifically crafted for this mod bolsters what would otherwise be a mild scene produced by the homogeneity in various atmospheric features such as color and tone. The level of auditory immersion meets that of Skyrim overall, but hardly ever exceeds it. There are various opportunities to characterize different atmospheres uniquely, and the usual case is a vanilla-style auditory persona. The amount of visual and auditory detailing applied to each atmosphere varies according to whether it reflects the image of Oblivion's Bruma, which may be an inevitable constraint in some cases, but does not completely strip the artists of introducing some supportive elements, such as the elaboration on contrast, color, tone, etc., although that's hardly saying anything that evidences a lackluster effort. I'd like to impart an addendum here on the elaboration of what atmosphere is by noting the research on beauty which, to the benefit of this paradigm, is expressed in both visual and auditory domains. In fact, a publication some years ago by PLOS ONE called Toward a Brain-Based Theory of Beauty demonstrated that both visual and auditory stimuli activated the medial orbitofrontal cortex, which is a pleasure and reward center in the brain, and essentially went so far as to show a correlation between blood oxygenation and neural activity beyond a threshold. That is to say that there is a correlation between the bold signal and intensity of experience of the stimuli according to their findings. Now, the implications and fundamental meanings behind those findings are still mysterious, but it shows that atmosphere, which is the most artistic aspect I scrutinize, may be the most artistically relevant in that we know that at the very least the experience of beauty here is material and more primal than a sort of up in the clouds, tabula rasa conception of what beauty is. We also ought to recognize that it should not mean we can proceed to qualify a scene as beautiful with respect to the work done by an author without paying attention to what the author has done for the scene versus what other authors have done to provide the components for that scene. But that differs to rational inquiry anyway. The point is that atmosphere is artistically relevant on a neurobiological level in both its auditory and visual highlights. The most encountered inadequate part about this mod is the introductory phase if you choose to sneak through the mountain, as the cave isn't very interesting and it's quite repetitive. Authors can hardly afford to provide sluggish introductions to their creations in light of the opportunity for the presentation of novelty, creativity, and behavioral sway, by which I mean the advent of favor garnered on the part of the author through the aforementioned characteristics, which can begin to work to create a fanatic out of the player if the author so chooses to do so. So, for example, making something that would inspire the player to continue on with the mod in the very beginning to spark their interest in the first place. This mod also poorly introduces novel features and relies on the player discovering them instead, which may be acceptable if some small part of those novelties were to be introduced in an interesting light. In other words, they could have done something more with things such as new races, perhaps something like creating an interesting and inevitable scene to announce their presence more energetically. The evidence for which I can make the point that the gameplay is sufficiently intense so as to maintain the player's focus in terms of creating a challenge is not enough to say it keeps you on the ropes. Most of the enemies you end up engaging are no different than what you would expect in a typical vanilla dungeon. Most of the novelty and creativity is found in battling new kinds of adversaries and to some degree playing different kinds of quests, although the gameplay hardly varies from convention. The flex of play is well designed overall, as there are no accidental or unnecessary obstacles which prevent the player from continuing a quest, despite some few but relevant cases where finding the way to completion was difficult because of confusion or obscurity, such as the Cave to Skyrim, in which there were quite a few twists and turns that were prone to stop the player to no resourceful purpose. Having said all that, the entertainment is largely found in exploration and meddling with the stories of characters in Bruma, although many of the looting style quests where you go to fetch or kill someone, or a combination of both, ended up being vanilla typical, as it were. And so something where you are assigned to go to a dungeon and get something out of that dungeon ended up being very conventional, which didn't help in providing some novelty that would otherwise augment the entertainment. This mod displays the capacity for the construction of conceptually grand visualizations, despite that they are relatively scarce, but many of the dungeons contain scenic and visually distinct imagery. Most levels don't have a complete sense of conceptual grandness, or conceptual impression, let's say, and I can't reason a way in which the authors would have been restricted from implementing it more thoroughly across the board, despite that they can be done in virtually any case. And so an example of this, to elaborate, would be something like a city on a hill, in which one can simply make a city on a hill, and it's, to put it somewhat colloquially, rather generic. Or you can make something like Endral, where not only do you make a city on a hill, but it has a name. It's not just any other city, it's Ark. It's a towering city on a hill that's kind of the center of the world. It has its own personality. It has its own kind of unique flavor that allows a player to more easily remember that scene. So it's quite a memorable place. And that can be done with dungeons as well, even in light of the need to use something like Nordic architecture, which is very mundane and difficult to work with. One could still find creative measures to find a conceptual impression for the level they're creating, so that it doesn't just have to be another Nordic ruin. It has a name, it has a personality, it's set apart from all the other Nordic ruins because it's conceptually unique, conceptually bigger than the visual concepts, the artistic concepts that compose the other dungeons. So at the same time that the conceptual impression in this mod is lacking overall, you can scarcely ever find a significant location that does not exhibit enough visual majesty to become visually iconic. In terms of the fundamental elements of visualization, such as detail, such as coloration, such as using the base meshes to make something interesting. The most visually creative portions of the mod come from the natural scenery, in which the authors creatively place the same kinds of terrain and vegetation meshes found in Skyrim in a way that describes the personality apart from the nature in Skyrim. The geographical layout of Bruma is more rugged and vibrant than most regions in Skyrim. One can even go so far as to experiment with this notion algorithmically, and this can be done for any mod and should emphasize the topical variety and can be used to gauge material variety independently. Basically, just select any two random cells from Skyrim's world space and the world space of the mod in question, and place static meshes that compose those cells into categorical buckets so as to categorize the nature of the cell and compare the resultant distributions. More uniform and expansive distributions intuitively typically ought to mean greater variety. And so to that end, we can effectively come closer to a more descriptive and more absolute sense of what we mean by visual impact and visual detail and visual variety, since it's essentially a quantization of visual detail. This is what I did when looking at Falskar to evidence my argument that its outside world was mundane. Just an aside here, if you're going to go for a comedic gesture or add humor into your mod, you should do something like Bruma.
To which it is streaming. I'm distressing the customers.
That's what I just said, yes.
Can I help you? You dare! How dare you! I am outraged. You hired me to play songs in this bar that is so far below my standards, and now you proclaim my music as distressful? Can I help you? I'm done with you standards,
and not put a stupid arrow in the knee joke in which maybe it was funny the 8 millionth time, maybe, but don't try to be comedic if you're not going to be clever about it, and end up putting a cringy joke or kind of a failure of a joke that, you know, after aging ends up just seeming quite awkward. And you all know what various mods I'm referring to, probably. I just thought that it was interesting that one of the most outstanding scenes in Bruma was the time where you encounter the bard who sings horribly and is kind of a grumpy, strangely presumptuous person. That is a creative way to put comedy in your mod, right? As opposed to something like just putting a stupid arrow in the knee joke somewhere and the player kind of, you know, they're over it, but it's like, yeah, for the millionth time, that's your clever attempt at comedy. Anyway, but that was, yeah, I thought that was a very unique scene. Basically, one of the funniest scenes across any Skyrim mod. So that was an interesting character. And if you were able to replicate something like that across your characters, that would make for quite an entertaining set of characters to use to augment the entertainment in your mod. No question, of course, those kind of incidents would have to be comparatively rare in order to magnify their significance and the reaction to them. Most of the characters follow the Elder Scrolls template of character introduction and development, although there are many examples where the detailing of a character exceeds sufficiency when using Skyrim's characters as a baseline. Plot development unravels in the same way and is quest-driven. The primary collective issue with the plots is that they are largely independent threads, and there is no main quest per se to drive home any thematic message or afford the mod some literary depth on which to represent its narrative element, despite that the authors had all the opportunity to tie in something like that together along with the rest of the quests. So in the end, there isn't any narrative-driven content that packs so much of a punch that the player leaves Bruma with something meaningful. Overall, the mod is very well balanced, as the variance across rating aspect, as you can see, is not too extreme, and the result is that the mod comes off as professionally crafted and is well done across the board, as opposed to some mods which sort of have this tunnel vision approach and magnify only one aspect of what composes their mod and end up having severely lacking qualities in other parts of the mod, and the result is to look at that and imagine that it was not so professionally or uniformly well built.